initiating development with a flexible knight sortie, aiming to influence the center without committing pawn structures. Instantly seizing central influence and preventing white's easy pawn advances, this solidifies black's territorial ambitions. Establishing central pawn presence and aiming for a symmetrical English structure immediately challenges black's queenside ambitions. Developing the knight to its natural square supports the d-pawn and prepares for central pawn pushes, actively contesting space. Reinforcing the knight's central presence, this knight's redeployment prepares to exert pressure and control more of the board's core. Boldly seizing central territory, e5 immediately challenges white's knight and fights for the initiative. Preparing a kingside fianchetto offers flexibility, aiming to control the long diagonal and potentially castle into a safer position while maintaining central influence. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure prepares a fianchetto for the bishop, creating a robust defensive formation. Instilling a long-term diagonal pressure on the kingside, the bishop embarks on a strategic journey, promising future support for pawn advances. Black symmetrically mirrors white's fianchetto, preparing for potential central skirmishes and solidifying the kingside. Securing the monarch is paramount in this symmetrical opening, transforming the king's safety into a primary positional objective, ready to support future pawn breaks or regroup pieces to a more active role. Asserting central presence, d6 solidifies the pawn chain and prepares for potential nf6 development, while subtly limiting the scope of white's bg2 across the long diagonal. Guarding the queenside expansion, a preemptive measure against potential b5 thrusts, aims to solidify the pawn structure and limit black's piece mobility on that flank. Developing the knight to e7 positions it to potentially challenge white's central pawn structure from a more robust square, offering flexibility for either supporting a d5 push or rerouting to f5 for defensive duties on the kingside. Solidifying the center and preparing a potential kingside pawn storm. Safeguarding the monarch completes a crucial development step, reinforcing the kingside structure and preparing for potential middle-game skirmishes by ensuring king's safety and allowing further piece activation. Safeguarding the rook, white prepares to challenge the queenside expansion, potentially opening the b-file for a future attack on black's king if the center imbalances. Expanding along the queenside with the pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's harmonious piece development, potentially seizing space and creating targets for future attacks. Unshackling the queen's knight, this maneuver aims to reroute it towards the kingside, potentially supporting a future e4 push or reinforcing squares around the white monarch by creating a flexible defensive network. It's a subtle repositioning, seeking to improve piece harmony and unlock potential attacking avenues without immediate commitment. This knight's journey highlights the intricate dance of piece development, where seemingly quiet moves can sow the seeds for future dynamism. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, this piece now eyes the kingside and potentially supports nb4 idea, while also reinforcing the central d5 square should white attempt to seize space there. Stepping the knight back from the center, white signals a shift towards a more patient, positional game, aiming to solidify control over the queenside and potentially launch a future pawn storm. Striking at the center like this immediately throws open the position and challenges white's comfortable pawn structure. This bold pawn thrust forces a reevaluation of the entire board, potentially creating dynamic imbalances that black might thrive in. Challenging the center's dominance directly with this pawn exchange injects immediate tactical complexity, forcing a reassessment of piece development and potential pawn structure weaknesses for both sides. Accepting the central pawn exchange offers immediate counterplay by unlocking the knight's potential and opening a path for the queen. A surprising retreat, rerouting the knight to potentially support a later e4 push or bolster kingside defense. Steering the knight back towards the center offers a flexible repositioning, potentially eyeing central squares or reinforcing the kingside should white dare to advance there. Seizing the initiative, this knight pivots towards the queenside, aiming to disrupt black's intended central expansion and potentially create attacking chances on the wing. Black establishes a crucial pawn chain on the queen side, reinforcing their central presence and creating a solid defensive structure against white's kingside fianchetto. This move signals a commitment to controlling the b-file, potentially preparing for future queenside expansion or a defensive maneuver to prevent white from gaining headway there. The rook's redeployment also frees up the e8 square for potential knight maneuvering or reinforces the king's defense, depending on how the game unfolds. It's a quiet but purposeful move that prioritizes solidity and future options. Unleashing a bold bishop attack, this aggressive maneuver immediately contests the central files and threatens to dismantle black's harmonious pawn structure by targeting the knight on e7. Challenging the bishop's influence, f6 seeks to disrupt white's harmonious setup and prepare for potential counterplay on the kingside. Shifting the bishop from the attack on the d5 knight to the queenside aims to solidify the pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn advances or a rerouting of pieces, though it does relinquish a degree of initiative in the center. Black reinforces the queenside pawn chain, creating a solid structure that aims to restrict white's kingside expansion and potentially prepare a queenside counterplay on the b-file. Intensifying pressure on the queenside, white's queen swoops in, aiming to exploit the slight awkwardness of black's pieces and potentially create a passed pawn scenario on the c-file if black isn't careful. Exploiting the overextended queen's post, black boldly injects a knight into the center, seeking to disrupt white's delicate pawn structure and challenge the queenside control. Breaking open the d-file offers a direct confrontation, forcing black to choose between maintaining pawn structure and activating their pieces. White is essentially saying, let's clarify this central tension. I'm ready for the ensuing exchanges. The absorption of the knight on d4 significantly alters the pawn chains, potentially opening lines for white's rooks and bishops later on, though it also grants black a certain centrality with the remaining knights. This exchange is a decisive step in white's plan to exploit the queenside space gained by the a3 and rb1 pawn ramps. Exposing the d4 pawn to immediate threat, this recapture opens up the central diagonal for white's bishop and creates a dynamic pawn structure. Black's intention is likely to solidify this central foothold, but the immediate consequence is a potential target for white's pieces. Consider the long-term implications of this isolated pawn. Will it become a strength or a weakness as the game progresses, and how might white exploit its precarious position? The game now pivots on whether black can successfully defend this advanced pawn while continuing development, or if white can generate enough pressure to make its defense untenable. A bold thrust into the center, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain a foothold on the queenside, potentially forcing a reaction that could expose weaknesses. Reclaiming the central influence with the knight's advance from e7 to d5 directly challenges white's entrenched queenside presence and prepares to contest the vital central squares, aiming to disrupt the harmony of white's pieces and create opportunities for counterplay by activating the kingside defenses. Unleashing a bold pawn thrust on the queenside, white immediately seeks to destabilize black's pawn structure and create dynamic play. This aggressive maneuver aims to pry open the queenside for white's pieces, potentially targeting weak squares or files. Be mindful of the counterplay black might generate, especially along the open diagonals and the newly created weaknesses. Unlocking the queenside is the immediate goal, aiming to dismantle the pawn chain and create active counterplay for the isolated d-pawn. The rook's repositioning to the open file immediately intensifies pressure on black's queenside structure. This audacious pawn sacrifice shatters the static pawn structure, seeking to unravel white's queenside and inject tactical complications into what was becoming a rather quiet positional struggle, potentially creating a vital outpost for the knight on c4 or opening the b-file. A bold pawn sacrifice is unleashed, opening a vital file for the rook and inviting tactical skirmishes. Seizing the initiative, black embraces the open file, dramatically altering the game's complexion and forcing white to confront immediate pressure along the now accessible rank, a crucial turning point where the pawn structure dictates the subsequent strategic struggle. Cleverly targeting the d6 pawn forces black to confront a structural weakness, potentially creating a passed pawn for white if black decides to capture on c7, or opening up the c-file for white's rook if black ignores the threat. Asserting queenside presence, this maneuver ignites a fascinating positional struggle, aiming to disrupt white's otherwise harmonious pawn structure and potentially activate the light-squared bishop later. Fortifying the c-file, white establishes a crucial defensive bulwark against black's queen and potential advancements, securing the newly opened territory for future operations. Black aims to re-establish central presence and free the rooks by introducing the d-file for the queen's rook, a crucial step to contest the open file that white's queen occupies. Reclaiming the queen now clarifies the central structure, but simultaneously grants black immediate access to the d-file, potentially unbalancing the initiative. Retreating the bishop to f8 re-establishes defensive solidarity, but it sacrifices valuable central influence and allows white's queen to probe menacingly on the b-file, potentially leading to an exposed queenside for black if not addressed with extreme caution. Capitalizing on the pressure built on the kingside, this queen sacrifice opens a decisive assault on black's vulnerable royal position, aiming to dismantle the defensive structure and exploit the weakened dark squares around the king. A bold gambit is offered, sacrificing the exchange for initiative and aiming to disrupt white's coordination with the central pawn push. Recapturing the queen with your own queen immediately simplifies the position, sacrificing immediate material pressure for a potentially sounder structure as you look to consolidate your advantage. The recapture on d6 is forced, but it signals a significant shift. Black must now navigate a queenless middle game with a slightly compromised pawn structure, aiming to solidify their position and exploit any lingering weaknesses in white's coordination. A decisive simplification into an endgame where white's pawn structure is superior, and the knight on d6 reigns supreme, controlling vital squares and cutting off black's queen from effective counterplay. The doubled pawns, though a temporary inconvenience, now serve as crucial anchors in the center, offering black solid prospects for queenside counterplay. The rook finally secures the critical 6th rank, aiming to hem in the opponent's weakened queenside and disrupt any potential counterplay along that vulnerable edge of the board. Asserting dominion over the open file, this pawn push immediately challenges white's advantage and aims to trade off a key defender. The exchange of queens has dramatically simplified the position, ushering in an endgame where the open c-file becomes a paramount battleground for white's rook. Unleashing a surprising check, the black rook boldly penetrates the white camp, aiming to disrupt the recently acquired material advantage and sow discord among the king's defenders.